So as we said, Wittgenstein is giving this fundamentally unsystematic picture of language. On his picture of language, all there is just these catalogue of different uses. There's just this big long list of language games. There's nothing that they all share. They all count as uses of language, and they all count as meaningful uses of language because they're sufficiently related to some other things in that class. But there's nothing in general that they all share. And there's no notion of the meaning of the word that is present in all the uses of that word. Our other reading for today was the end of this paper by Chomsky. And as you saw in that paper by Chomsky, what he's doing is he's critiquing this behaviorist view of language from B.F. Skinner. Now, Skinner's picture of language was quite different from Wittgenstein's. It was actually a lot cruder. And Wittgenstein was not Chomsky's primary target. Actually, really, the two traditions, as far as I know, did not really overlap much at this point in time. There just wasn't a lot of conversation going on between linguists and psycholinguists who were talking about language and Wittgensteinians. But there was this kind of common feature that people like Skinner were suspicious of this notion of the meaning of a word. They thought that to say that a word meant something was maybe this kind of unverifiable claim. The only way that we can make sense of it is to reduce it to claims about people's behavior. So even though Skinner did not exactly have the same view as Wittgenstein, something he did think, and something that does seem to be an important commonality, is that really all there is to meaning has to just boil down to language use. And for this reason, I think the kind of criticisms that Chomsky made of Skinner actually arguably also apply to Wittgenstein's theory. I also say the claim that Chomsky's criticisms apply to Wittgenstein, that's a controversial claim in itself. It's something that I think is true, but it's going to be something that will be also helpful for you guys to think about. But the other reason I want to talk about it is because these ideas that Chomsky introduced are some of the main reasons why people continue to think that language must be indeed systematic rather than fundamentally unsystematic as Wittgenstein thought. It's these kinds of ideas that came out of Chomsky which I think persuade people that the kind of view Wittgenstein had of language is incorrect. So arguably these criticisms do carry over to Wittgenstein, but also sociologically I think that these kinds of criticisms are more or less the reason why people abandoned this kind of way of thinking about language. So they're going to be important for you to think about. So the first thing that Chomsky observes in the passage that we read is this observation about what people now call productivity. And the idea is that basically we are all the time saying new sentences that have never been said before, and we have no problem at all in understanding them. So people can say brand new sentences to us that we've never heard and maybe have never been uttered before in the entire history of humanity. And maybe in no language in the entire history of humanity has a sentence with that meaning ever been uttered. And yet we can understand it without batting an eye. So here's arguably an example of that, just to persuade you. Take the sentence, the tallest gorilla in the world is not one of the leading Wittgenstein scholars, or is not one of the top 10 Wittgenstein scholars. Now think about that for a moment. Not only is this a meaningful claim, it looks like a true claim. Probably there are no gorillas who are Wittgenstein scholars, so in particular, the tallest gorilla in the world is not a top 10 Wittgenstein scholar. So not only do we understand that sentence, we're able to immediately say that it's true, but probably that sentence has never been said before. I deliberately picked a kind of wild example, a kind of silly question of whether, are any gorillas Wittgenstein scholars. Now, obviously, that's not a question we would spend a lot of time thinking about. The point is that there's no problem in understanding what that sentence said. And there's no problem in understanding it, even though probably nobody has ever really asked the question whether gorillas are Wittgenstein scholars, and nobody has ever given this answer. That being said, even though it's never been done, we can instantly recognize that this is not only can we understand the question, we can also understand immediately that this answer to the question is meaningful and true. And this isn't an isolated incident. Now, I picked a kind of radical example, but this happens all the time. We're all the time saying sentences that we've never heard before. We're all the time hearing sentences that we've never heard before. If you want an example, just think about your classes in university. all the time you're being told sentences you've never heard before. That's kind of exactly why you learn so much in university. But, in principle, we are able to understand these things, even though we've never heard them. So that's the productivity observation, that we're hearing these new sentences all the time, and we understand them. And we're saying these new sentences all the time, even though we've never heard them before. Now, why are we able to do that? Why are we able to utter these new sentences and know what they mean? Why are we able to hear these new sentences and know what they mean? Because on the face of it, you might have thought, well, if you've never heard it before, then how would you be in a position to understand it? But if you think about what we already talked about in this course, we've already talked about the main idea, which would arguably explain this observation, and that's the idea of compositionality. Remember what the principle of compositionality said. It says that the meaning of a sentence is determined by the meanings of its parts and the way they're put together. And what this means is that, well, once you know the meanings of all the words in a sentence, and you understand the principles of grammar and how they correspond to the meaning of a sentence coming out of their arrangement of words, then that's enough by itself to understand what the meaning of the sentence is. Because according to compositionality, once you know the meanings of the words, and once you know the rules governing how to combine words together to get new meanings, then you know the meanings of any sentences which contain those words in those order. So for instance, once you know the meaning of the phrase, the tallest gorilla in the world, and once you know the meaning of the phrase, is not one of the top 10 Wittgenstein scholars, and once you know in general how to put together, sentences of the form, the F is G, in order to get meanings as a whole, then you're going to understand the meaning of the sentence. And you're also going to understand what happens when we add not as well. You know in general the rule that corresponds to the meaning of not. And that's the general picture of how we understand sentences like that weird one I said a moment ago. Even though you've probably never encountered those words in that sequence before, you know what the meaning of the sentence is because you know the meanings of all the words involved in it, and you know how to get meanings of bigger parts by putting them together out of their smaller parts. So this idea of compositionality seems to explain the observation of productivity. It's precisely because language is compositional that we're able to understand these new sentences when they're said to us, because they're said to us containing words we already understand, and put together in ways that we know how to get new meanings out of their arrangement. And the same thing goes for the sentences we're saying. When we're saying new sentences, we're doing so with words we already understand, putting them together with rules that we understand as well. So that's productivity and how productivity is explained by compositionality. What does any of this have to do with Wittgenstein? Well, the reason I think it has something to do with Wittgenstein is, remember, Wittgenstein said really there kind of is nothing really to the idea of the meaning of a word. There's just the different ways it might be used. But there's no such thing as like the object that the word stands for. And in general, he seems to be kind of against saying there's like a meaning of a word that is partly explains all the different uses of it. Remember, he thinks language is kind of unsystematic in that way. But if you say that, if you deny there's this kind of general notion of meaning that words have, if you say all there really is are just the different individual ways in which they're used, it's hard to see how you could give this compositionality explanation. Why would you be able to say compositionality explains why we're able to understand and use new sentences? Because in Wittgenstein's view, all there is just there's a collection of different ways in which the words are used, and coming to learn language is just coming to know what you do in those practices. But Chomsky's observation is that, whatever about there being all these practices, it's immediately obvious how to understand these new sentences when you utter them. It's immediately obvious what this sentence about the gorilla means. But it's hard to see how that would work in Wittgenstein's picture, because that sentence, it's not like is there a practice corresponding to that sentence? What language game is the gorilla sentence being used in? It doesn't look like there's any current language game that we play that sentence is present in. But if there isn't any language game that sentence is part of, then what is the use of it? How are we supposed to understand the meaning of it on the Wittgensteinian picture? It's just not obvious really how it fits in. And indeed, the precise point of productivity is that productivity involves sentences that either have just absolutely never been used before, or ones that you've never encountered before. If all there was to understanding the meaning of something was knowing how it's used, if you've never encountered any of the uses of these things, and maybe or even worse, there just is no previous use, it's hard to explain on this language game picture, like, why they mean anything at all. By contrast, on the systematic view of language, where words really do have meanings, words maybe stand for things, and there are rules about how to get the meanings of more complex things out of more simple things, it's pretty straightforward how we would explain productivity. We just explain it through compositionality plus the meanings of the words. And as I said, that isn't an explanation it looks like Wittgenstein can give, because it looks like he's kind of denying the fundamental units of the explanation, like the meanings of the individual words. He doesn't seem to think that words have meanings in the way that this explanation presupposes. And indeed, this general sort of systematic, rules-based explanation of how you understand the meanings of these novel sentences really seems kind of at odds with Wittgenstein's whole understanding of how language is supposed to work. So this fact about productivity is really hard to square with the language game picture that Wittgenstein gives, or at least so I think.